In the fog-shrouded hills of northern England, where the Industrial Revolution had left its mark in blackened stone and poisoned streams, there stood in the year 1887 an institution that bore the noble name of St. Agatha's Home for Foundling Children. From the outside, the imposing Gothic structure appeared to be exactly what its charter proclaimed: a sanctuary for the abandoned and unwanted, a place where Christian charity might transform society's most vulnerable into productive citizens of the empire. But behind its ornate iron gates and beneath its soaring spires lay secrets so dark that when they were finally exposed, they would shake the very foundations of Victorian society's faith in progress and human decency. The man responsible for transforming this house of mercy into a chamber of horrors was Dr. Cornelius Eldridge, a physician whose reputation for innovative treatments had earned him acclaim in London's most prestigious medical circles. Educated at Cambridge and trained in the finest hospitals of the continent, Eldridge possessed the kind of brilliant mind that the age celebrated as evidence of mankind's inexorable march toward enlightenment. His published papers on anatomy and physiology had earned him fellowship in the Royal College of Surgeons, while his theoretical work on the malleability of human development had garnered attention from scientists across Europe. When Eldridge accepted the position of Chief Medical Officer at St. Agatha's in the spring of 1885, the Board of Trustees believed they had secured the services of a humanitarian genius who would revolutionize the care of orphan children. His proposals for modern medical facilities, innovative educational programs, and scientific approaches to child development seemed to promise a new era of enlightened institutional care. The substantial endowment he brought with him from unnamed benefactors only added to his appeal, providing resources that would allow St. Agatha's to expand its mission beyond mere custodial care. The children who entered St. Agatha's during Eldridge's tenure came from the usual sources that fed Victorian orphanages: workhouse deaths that left children with no family, industrial accidents that claimed parents, and the simple abandonment that poverty often forced upon desperate families. They arrived as ordinary children, bearing the physical marks of malnutrition and neglect common to their class, but possessed of the same essential humanity that characterized all young people regardless of their circumstances. What happened to them within the walls of St. Agatha's would challenge every assumption about the nature of childhood, the ethics of medical practice, and the limits of human cruelty disguised as scientific progress. The transformation that Eldridge wrought upon these innocent souls was so complete, so fundamentally altering, that by the time his work was discovered, many of the children could no longer be recognized as fully human. The first hints that something was amiss at St. Agatha's emerged in the winter of 1887, when local villagers began reporting strange sounds emanating from the orphanage during the darkest hours of night. These were not the usual noises of institutional life, the crying of homesick children, or the movements of staff conducting their duties, but sounds that defied easy description. Witnesses spoke of wailing that seemed to come from no human throat, of mechanical noises that suggested machinery more complex than anything that should exist in a children's home, and of conversations conducted in voices that somehow seemed wrong, as if the speakers were attempting to use vocal apparatus not designed for human speech. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, whose cottage stood nearest to the orphanage grounds, kept a detailed journal of these nocturnal disturbances that would later prove crucial to understanding the timeline of Eldridge's experiments. Her entries describe a gradual escalation of unusual activity, beginning with occasional strange lights in windows that should have been dark and progressing to sounds so disturbing that she eventually moved her own children to sleep in the cellar, as far from the orphanage as her small home would allow. The isolation of St. Agatha's, which had once been considered an advantage for the moral development of its charges, now worked to Eldridge's benefit by limiting outside observation of his activities. The institution's grounds covered nearly 50 acres of moorland, surrounded by walls that had been built high to protect the children from the corrupting influences of the outside world. These same walls now served to contain secrets that would have horrified even the most hardened observers of Victorian medical practice. Inside the orphanage, Eldridge had constructed what he termed his laboratory of human development, a complex of rooms in the building's extensive cellars that housed equipment and facilities unlike anything found in conventional medical institutions. His private journals, discovered years later hidden behind false walls in his personal chambers, reveal the scope of his ambitions and the methodical progression of his descent into scientific madness. The doctor's initial experiments focused on what he called physiological enhancement, attempts to improve upon the natural development of his young subjects through surgical intervention and chemical manipulation. His theoretical foundation drew upon emerging ideas about evolution and adaptation, twisted into a philosophy that viewed childhood as a malleable state that could be directed toward any desired outcome through proper scientific management. Children who entered his laboratory were subjected to procedures that began as seemingly medical treatments for common ailments, but gradually evolved into something far more sinister. Eldridge's notes describe attempts to optimize human development by surgically altering bone structure, experimenting with glandular transplants from animals, and introducing chemical compounds that would affect growth patterns in ways that natural biology never intended. The children who survived these initial interventions emerged changed in ways that their caretakers struggled to understand or explain. Some exhibited alterations in physical development that made them appear older or younger than their actual years, while others displayed modifications to their sensory capabilities that seemed to enhance certain abilities while diminishing others. Most disturbing of all were those who underwent what Eldridge termed neurological restructuring, procedures that affected not just their physical development, but their very capacity for human thought and emotion. As we delve deeper into these forbidden chapters of medical history, one cannot help but reflect on how the pursuit of knowledge without moral constraint can lead to unimaginable horrors. The story we're uncovering serves as a stark reminder of the importance of ethical boundaries in scientific research. If you're drawn to these dark explorations of history's hidden atrocities, I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below and join our community of truth seekers by subscribing to the channel. Sister Mary Catherine, one of the few staff members who maintained detailed records of the children's conditions, left behind a journal that provides the most complete picture available of the transformation that overtook St. Agatha's during Eldridge's tenure. Her entries, written in increasingly shaky handwriting as the months progressed, document her growing horror at what she witnessed in the orphanage's daily life. "The children no longer play as children should," she wrote in November of 1887. "Their games have taken on characteristics that seem more suited to adults, or perhaps to creatures that have never known childhood at all. Little Margaret, who came to us as sweet and innocent as any 6-year-old might be, now speaks in mathematical formulas and demonstrates an understanding of human anatomy that would be remarkable in a medical student. When she looks at me, I feel as though I am being studied rather than seen." The sister's observations extended beyond individual children to the overall atmosphere of the institution. She noted that the traditional sounds of childhood, laughter, crying, the simple noise of play, had been replaced by something far more unsettling. The children moved through their daily routines with a mechanical precision that suggested their spontaneity had been systematically eliminated. Their conversations, when they occurred at all, focused on subjects far beyond their supposed years and interests. Most troubling to Sister Mary Catherine were the children's reactions to pain and pleasure, which seemed to have been fundamentally altered by their experiences in Eldridge's laboratory. Physical injuries that should have caused tears and complaint were met with clinical observation and analysis. Acts of kindness that should have brought joy were received with the same dispassionate attention that might be given to interesting but irrelevant phenomena. The physical changes that many children exhibited were equally disturbing. Eldridge's experiments with growth hormones and surgical modification had created individuals whose bodies seemed to defy natural development patterns. Some children appeared to age rapidly, their faces taking on adult characteristics, while their bodies remained small and weak. Others experienced the opposite effect, maintaining childlike features while developing adult strength and capabilities that seemed impossible for their apparent age. Perhaps most unsettling were those children who bore the marks of Eldridge's attempts at what he termed adaptive enhancement. These young people displayed modifications that seemed designed to improve their capabilities, but had instead created beings that existed in an uncanny valley between human and something else entirely. Their eyes, often surgically altered to enhance visual acuity, reflected light in ways that suggested fundamental changes to their structure. Their limbs, lengthened or strengthened through intervention, moved with unnatural precision that made their normal activities appear somehow wrong. The doctor's journals reveal that he viewed these changes not as disfigurement, but as improvement, evidence of humanity's potential for directed evolution under proper scientific guidance. His entries describe the children with the detached fascination of a researcher observing experimental subjects, noting their developing capabilities with satisfaction while showing no apparent awareness of their psychological suffering. Subject 17 demonstrates remarkable adaptation to the modifications, reads one typical entry from December 1887. The integration of enhanced sensory apparatus proceeds according to theoretical projections, with minimal rejection response. The subject's ability to process visual information in spectral ranges beyond normal human capability suggests promising applications for future development. Psychological adjustment requires continued monitoring, as subject exhibits occasional episodes of distress when confronted with unmodified humans. The psychological adjustment that Eldridge mentioned so casually represented one of the most horrific aspects of his experimental program. The children who survived his physical modifications often found themselves trapped between their remaining human emotions and the alien capabilities they had been given. They retained enough of their original nature to understand that they had been changed, but possessed new sensory and cognitive abilities that made normal human interaction increasingly difficult. Sister Mary Catherine's journal describes heartbreaking encounters with children who begged to be returned to their former selves, who understood enough about their situation to recognize that they had been robbed of something essential to their humanity. Little Thomas asked me yesterday if the bad dreams would stop, if he could forget how to see the colors that hurt his eyes, she wrote. When I told him I didn't understand, he pointed to the walls and described patterns of light that exist beyond normal vision. He wept as he told me that he can no longer look at other people without seeing things that frighten him, colors that move beneath their skin like living things. The isolation that had once protected the children from outside corruption now trapped them in a world where their modified capabilities made them increasingly alien to normal human experience. Those who could still speak often described their predicament in terms that revealed their awareness of their loss, speaking of memories of being normal that seemed like dreams from another life. Eldridge's experiments were not confined to physical modification. His journals reveal an extensive program of psychological manipulation designed to test the limits of human adaptability and to explore what he termed the optimization of consciousness. Children were subjected to sensory deprivation and overstimulation, exposed to psychological conditioning techniques that were advanced even by modern standards, and forced to participate in cognitive exercises that seemed designed to reshape their fundamental thought processes. The doctor's theoretical framework drew upon emerging ideas in psychology and neurology, combined with his own twisted interpretation of evolutionary theory. He believed that human consciousness was inefficiently structured, limited by evolutionary compromises that had served survival needs, but now constrained the species' potential for development. His experiments sought to eliminate these limitations by rewiring the neural pathways of developing minds, creating children whose thought processes would be optimized for capabilities that normal humans could never achieve. The results of these psychological experiments were perhaps even more disturbing than the physical modifications. Children who had entered the orphanage with normal emotional responses and social instincts emerged from Eldridge's treatment as beings whose inner lives bore little resemblance to human experience. They retained the ability to communicate and to perform complex tasks, but their motivations and reactions seemed to follow patterns that defied understanding. One of the most detailed accounts of these psychological changes comes from the testimony of Dr. James Whitmore, a visiting physician who toured St. Agatha's in early 1888. Whitmore had come to the orphanage at the invitation of the Board of Trustees, who were beginning to receive disturbing reports about conditions at the institution and hoped that an outside medical perspective might provide reassurance about Eldridge's methods. What Whitmore discovered during his visit shocked him so profoundly that he immediately contacted authorities in London and refused to remain on the premises for more than a single day. His report, preserved in the archives of the Royal College of Physicians, describes encounters with children whose behavior patterns suggested fundamental alterations to their psychological makeup. I was invited to observe what Dr. Eldridge termed An educational exercise, Whitmore wrote. A group of children, aged between 8 and 12 by appearance, were engaged in solving mathematical problems of extraordinary complexity. Their ability to perform these calculations was remarkable, but far more disturbing was their complete lack of emotional response to success or failure. They approached each problem with mechanical precision, showed no joy in achievement, and displayed no frustration when they encountered difficulties. When I attempted to engage them in conversation about subjects appropriate to their apparent age, they responded with polite incomprehension, as if I were speaking of concepts that existed outside their experience. Whitmore's report goes on to describe children whose emotional lives seem to have been systematically eliminated or redirected toward purposes that served Eldridge's experimental goals rather than their own development. They showed no interest in play, no affection for caretakers or fellow residents, and no apparent desire for anything beyond the completion of whatever tasks they had been assigned. Most disturbing to the visiting physician was his encounter with several children who had undergone what Eldridge termed empathic enhancement. These young people displayed an unnatural ability to read emotional states in others, but rather than using this capability for social connection, they seemed to employ it as a tool for manipulation and control. Their interactions with adults and other children were characterized by a calculating quality that suggested they viewed emotional responses as weaknesses to be exploited rather than aspects of shared humanity to be cherished. The discovery of Eldridge's atrocities began with the disappearance of 2 children from the orphanage in February of 1888. Unlike the many children who had simply vanished into the doctor's experimental program over the previous years, these 2, siblings named William and Sarah Thornton, had relatives in London who possessed both the resources and the determination to investigate their fate. The children's uncle, a barrister named Charles Thornton, had been sending regular payments for their care and expecting periodic reports on their progress. When his letters went unanswered and his attempts to visit were repeatedly delayed, he arrived at St. Agatha's unannounced and demanded to see his nephew and niece immediately. Eldridge's attempts to deflect Thornton's inquiries with vague explanations about medical treatment and educational placement only increased the barrister's suspicions. When he was finally permitted to tour portions of the orphanage, he noted discrepancies between the number of children visible and the enrollment records he had been shown. His legal training enabled him to ask precisely the right questions and to recognize evasive answers when he encountered them. The breakthrough came when Thornton discovered that his nephew William had been seen in the village several weeks earlier, but the boy who had been pointed out to him bore little resemblance to the child he remembered. Witnesses described a young person whose appearance and behavior seemed fundamentally altered, who moved with unnatural grace and spoke in patterns that suggested adult intelligence trapped in a child's form. Thornton's subsequent investigation revealed a pattern of deception that extended throughout Eldridge's administration of the orphanage. Records had been falsified to conceal the true number of children who had entered the institution, while correspondence with potential adoptive families had been systematically intercepted to prevent outside contact with the residents. The legal action that Thornton initiated brought scrutiny from authorities who possessed the power to demand access to all areas of St. Agatha's, including the cellars where Eldridge conducted his most secretive work. What they discovered there would become the subject of sensational newspaper coverage and parliamentary inquiry, though much of the evidence was considered too disturbing for public consumption. The laboratory facilities hidden beneath the orphanage were described by investigators as resembling something from a medieval torture chamber, updated with modern scientific equipment. Surgical tables bore stains that suggested their frequent use, while cabinets contained instruments whose purposes could only be guessed at, and chemicals whose effects on human subjects represented uncharted territory in medical practice. Most horrifying were the detailed records that Eldridge had maintained of his experiments, documents that revealed not only the scope of his activities, but his complete lack of recognition that what he was doing constituted anything other than legitimate scientific research. His notes described the children as experimental subjects rather than human beings, documenting their responses to various procedures with the dispassionate precision of a researcher studying laboratory animals. As our investigation reveals these depths of human cruelty disguised as scientific progress, we must ask ourselves how such horrors could have remained hidden for so long. If you find yourself compelled by these dark chapters of institutional history, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more explorations into the shadows that society prefers to forget. The children who were discovered in Eldridge's laboratory presented investigators with challenges that no one was prepared to address. Many had been so fundamentally altered by their experiences that determining their original identities proved nearly impossible. Physical modifications had changed their appearances beyond recognition, while psychological conditioning had eliminated or altered their memories of life before entering the orphanage. Some of the children could no longer speak in conventional language, having been taught to communicate through systems that Eldridge had devised for his experimental purposes. Others possessed capabilities that seemed to transcend normal human limitations, but had lost the ability to relate to unmodified people in any meaningful way. A few appeared to have retained their essential humanity despite their physical changes, but they were so traumatized by their experiences that they could provide only fragmentary accounts of what had been done to them. The medical professionals called in to evaluate these children found themselves confronting conditions that had no precedent in their training or experience. The modifications that Eldridge had performed were often so radical that they defied conventional treatment, while the psychological damage appeared to be so extensive that recovery seemed impossible. Several of the children required constant medical supervision just to survive, as their altered physiology could not function properly without continued intervention. Dr. Margaret Sinclair, one of the few physicians willing to take responsibility for these young victims, left behind extensive notes that provide insight into the challenges of caring for Eldridge's subjects. Her observations reveal the extent to which the children had been changed, not just physically, but in ways that affected their most basic interactions with the world around them. Patient 7 appears to be approximately 12 years of age, but displays cognitive capabilities that would be remarkable in an adult scholar, Dr. Sinclair wrote. However, these intellectual gifts seem to exist in isolation from normal emotional development. The child can solve complex mathematical problems and demonstrate understanding of advanced scientific principles, but shows no interest in toys, games, or social interaction appropriate to his apparent age. When presented with stimuli designed to evoke emotional responses, he reacts with clinical detachment, as if observing phenomena that have no personal relevance. The doctor's notes go on to describe children whose sensory capabilities had been enhanced or altered in ways that made normal environments painful or overwhelming. Some could perceive light spectra invisible to normal humans, but found ordinary illumination unbearably bright. Others had developed auditory acuity that allowed them to hear sounds across great distances, but made normal conversation a cacophony of overwhelming noise. Perhaps most heartbreaking were those children who retained enough of their original personality to understand what had been lost. These young people could remember fragments of their lives before entering St. Agatha's, but found themselves trapped in bodies and minds that no longer functioned according to human norms. Their attempts to reconnect with their former selves often resulted in psychological breakdowns that required sedation and isolation. The legal proceedings against Eldridge revealed the full scope of his experimental program and the institutional failures that had allowed it to continue for so long. Testimony from staff members who had gradually become aware of the doctor's activities painted a picture of an institution where fear and professional intimidation had created a culture of silence that protected atrocities from exposure. Many of the caregivers who worked directly with the children had noticed the disturbing changes in their charges, but had been discouraged from asking questions or reporting their concerns. Eldridge had cultivated an atmosphere where questioning his methods was treated as evidence of ignorance or lack of scientific sophistication, while those who persisted in raising objections found themselves dismissed or transferred to positions where they could not observe his work. The Board of Trustees, when called to account for their failure to provide proper oversight, claimed ignorance of the experimental program's true nature. They pointed to Eldridge's prestigious credentials and the impressive reports he had provided about the orphanage's progress as evidence that they had no reason to suspect wrongdoing. However, financial records revealed that they had been receiving substantial payments from mysterious benefactors who had specifically requested that Eldridge be given complete autonomy in his medical research. The source of this funding was never definitively established, though investigators suspected connections to government agencies interested in Eldridge's work on human enhancement. The doctor's theoretical writings had attracted attention from military officials intrigued by the possibility of creating soldiers with superhuman capabilities, while his psychological research had potential applications for intelligence gathering and interrogation techniques. When Eldridge himself was finally located and arrested, he showed no remorse for his actions and seemed genuinely puzzled by the charges brought against him. His testimony during the subsequent trial revealed a man who had become so immersed in his experimental work that he had lost all connection to conventional moral reasoning. He spoke of the children as willing participants in scientific advancement and described their suffering as an unfortunate but necessary cost of progress. The transformation of human consciousness and capability represents the next stage of evolutionary development, Eldridge declared during one particularly disturbing exchange with prosecutors. These children have been given the opportunity to transcend the limitations that constrain ordinary humans. That they experience discomfort during the transition is regrettable but insignificant compared to the benefits they will ultimately derive from their enhanced capabilities. The trial became a sensation that captured public attention throughout Britain and much of Europe. Newspaper coverage of the proceedings introduced readers to concepts of scientific research that challenged fundamental assumptions about medical ethics and human experimentation. The testimony of victims and witnesses provided a glimpse into horrors that most people could scarcely imagine, while expert witnesses debated questions about the limits of scientific inquiry and the rights of experimental subjects. The jury's verdict of guilty on multiple charges of assault, battery, and unlawful experimentation was unanimous, but the sentence of life imprisonment seemed inadequate to many observers who believed that Eldridge's crimes merited more severe punishment. The judge's statement at sentencing reflected the difficulty of addressing atrocities that had no clear precedent in legal history. The defendant has committed acts that challenge our understanding of human depravity, the judge declared. Using the respected name of science to justify torture and mutilation of innocent children represents a perversion of knowledge that threatens the very foundations of civilized society. While the law does not permit me to impose the ultimate penalty that many believe these crimes deserve, I can ensure that the defendant will never again have the opportunity to harm another human being. Eldridge died in prison 3 years later, apparently of natural causes, though some suspected that his demise was hastened by fellow inmates who had learned the nature of his crimes. His death marked the end of legal proceedings, but not the conclusion of efforts to address the consequences of his experimental program. The children who survived Eldridge's experiments faced an uncertain future in a society that was largely unprepared to understand or accommodate their needs. Most required ongoing medical care that was expensive and complex, while their altered capabilities made integration into normal social environments extremely difficult. Some were placed in specialized institutions that attempted to provide appropriate care, while others remained in the custody of families brave enough to accept responsibility for their unique challenges. The long-term outcomes for these young victims varied widely. A few managed to adapt to their modifications and found ways to live productive lives despite their altered capabilities. Others struggled with ongoing medical problems and psychological trauma that made independent living impossible. Several disappeared from official records entirely, their fates unknown but presumed tragic. The institutional reforms that followed the St. Agatha's scandal established new protocols for oversight of medical research involving human subjects, particularly children. The case became a landmark in the development of medical ethics, influencing legislation and professional standards that continue to govern experimental procedures today. However, the broader questions raised by Eldridge's work about the limits of scientific inquiry, the rights of experimental subjects, and the potential for knowledge to be perverted into instruments of cruelty remain relevant to contemporary debates about medical research and human enhancement. The doctor's theories about directed evolution and consciousness optimization, while thoroughly discredited by his methods, continue to influence discussions about genetic engineering and cognitive enhancement technologies. The physical structure of St. Agatha's was demolished within months of Eldridge's arrest, as if the building itself had been contaminated by the atrocities committed within its walls. The site was eventually converted to a public park, though local residents reported that the area remained somehow unwelcoming, as if the very ground retained memories of the suffering it had witnessed. The surviving documentation of Eldridge's experiments was sealed by government order, with access restricted to qualified researchers who could demonstrate legitimate academic or legal need for the information. Much of this material remains classified to this day, though periodic releases of declassified documents have continued to reveal new details about the scope and nature of the experimental program. Modern medical historians who have studied the available evidence note that Eldridge's work, while morally reprehensible, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of developmental biology and psychology that was decades ahead of its time. His theoretical framework, stripped of its ethical violations, contained insights that would not be independently discovered by mainstream science for many years. This recognition has led to uncomfortable questions about the relationship between scientific progress and moral constraint. While no legitimate researcher would endorse Eldridge's methods, some have argued that his results provided valuable data about human development that could not have been obtained through ethical means. Others maintain that knowledge gained through such atrocities is forever tainted and should be excluded from scientific discourse entirely. The debate over how to handle Eldridge's legacy reflects broader tensions in the scientific community about the use of data obtained through unethical research. Similar controversies have arisen regarding medical experiments conducted by Nazi physicians, Japanese biological warfare units, and other researchers who violated fundamental principles of human dignity in pursuit of knowledge. The children who survived St. Agatha's, those who lived long enough to reach adulthood, rarely spoke publicly about their experiences. The few accounts that have been preserved describe lives marked by ongoing struggle with the consequences of Eldridge's modifications, both physical and psychological. Some found ways to use their enhanced capabilities for positive purposes, while others remained trapped by alterations that made normal social interaction impossible. One of the most detailed accounts comes from a man known only as Subject 23 in Eldridge's records, who eventually contacted authorities in 1923 to provide testimony about his experiences. His letter, preserved in government archives, offers a unique perspective on the long-term effects of the experimental program. "I have lived for 35 years with capabilities that no human should possess and memories that no child should carry," he wrote. "The things I can see and hear and understand would be considered gifts by those who do not comprehend their cost. I know the location of every person within half a mile of where I sit, can hear conversations taking place in distant buildings, and can solve mathematical problems that would challenge university professors. But I have never been able to look upon another human being without seeing them as a collection of biological processes rather than a person worthy of love." His account goes on to describe the isolation that his modifications had created, the inability to form normal relationships, and the constant awareness of being fundamentally different from the rest of humanity. Despite decades of effort, he had never been able to overcome the psychological conditioning that Eldridge had imposed, remaining trapped in patterns of thought and perception that made emotional connection impossible. The broader impact of the St. Agatha's scandal extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The revelation that such atrocities could be committed under the guise of scientific research shattered public confidence in medical authority and led to widespread skepticism about institutional care for vulnerable populations. Orphanages throughout Britain faced increased scrutiny and demands for accountability that resulted in significant reforms to their operations. The scandal also influenced public attitudes toward scientific research, creating a legacy of wariness about experimental procedures that continues to affect public health initiatives to this day. The case became a touchstone for discussions about the ethics of human experimentation and the need for informed consent in medical research. While these concepts seem fundamental today, they were largely unknown in Eldridge's era, when physicians enjoyed nearly absolute authority over their patients and research subjects. As we conclude this harrowing journey into one of history's darkest chapters of pseudo-scientific horror, we are reminded that the pursuit of knowledge without moral boundaries can lead to unimaginable cruelty. The story of Dr. Eldridge and his victims serves as an eternal warning about the dangers of unchecked authority, and the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members. The secrets that we uncover in these investigations into forgotten atrocities help ensure that such horrors are never repeated. If this exploration into the shadows of medical history has affected you, please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Together, we can keep these important stories alive and honor the memory of those who suffered by learning from the past. Which dark corner of history would you like us to illuminate next? Your engagement helps us continue this vital work of bringing light to the shadows that some would prefer remain hidden forever.